Merry Christmas, ma'am, from the boys at McGinty's.
Thank you. This little room was their whole world. Warm, fragile, and worth protecting. Did you eat?
Best thing I've tasted since before the war.
Don't let yourself go hungry.
On Christmas Eve, 1863, in a godforsaken Montana mining camp, where temperatures plunged to 40 below, a drunken miner stumbled from a saloon into a blizzard, and what he found in that howling darkness would haunt him for 5 years. But the real story, it didn't begin that frozen night. It began the moment a widow with 3 starving children learned that gold dust and stolen jewelry could buy survival, but not redemption. And it certainly didn't end when her laundry shop burned to the ground. Historians call the winter of 1863 in Montana the Big Freeze, but the men who lived through it didn't have a polite name for it. They just called it the White Death. That Christmas Eve, the thermometer at the assay office in Bannock bottomed out at 45 degrees below zero. At that temperature, mercury freezes solid. At that temperature, if you spit, turns to ice before it hits the ground. At that temperature, a man's lungs can freeze from the inside out if he breathes too deep. The only thing separating Jack Thornton from that frozen oblivion was a half-inch of pine wall at McGinty's saloon. Inside the atmosphere was a biological weapon. The room was packed with 80 men who hadn't seen a bathtub since October. The air was a visible blue haze of tobacco smoke, coal oil fumes, and the steam rising from drying wool coats that smelled like wet dog and desperation. Jack sat in the corner, staring into a glass of what the miners called tarantula juice. It wasn't whiskey. It was raw alcohol colored with chewing tobacco and spiced with ammonia. It tasted like gasoline, but it did the job. It numbed the ache in his back and the noise in his head. Jack was 40 years old, but in the dim light he looked 60. 2 years of panning for dust in freezing creeks had taken his youth. Empty. He was just waiting for the courage to quit or the bad luck to die. Around him, the festivities were in full swing. A fiddle player was butchering Silent Night, playing it so fast it sounded like a jig. Men were gambling away their children's inheritance on faro tables. It was loud, it was violent, and it was fake. Every man in there was terrified of silence, because silence meant thinking about the families they had left back east. Jack's bladder finally gave him an ultimatum. He pushed back from the table, swaying. The room spun. He grabbed his heavy buffalo coat, stiff with grease and dirt, and shoved his way to the back door. "Shut the damn door fast," someone screamed as Jack grabbed the latch. He stepped out. The cold didn't hit him like a wind. It hit him like a hammer. It sucked the air right out of his chest, instantly sobering him up. The moisture in his nose froze into needles. His eyes watered and immediately iced shut. Jack fumbled to relieve himself against the rough logs of the building, his fingers clumsy and numb in seconds. He was hurrying, desperate to get back to the poison warmth of the saloon. Then the wind died. Just for a second. In that brief, impossible silence, Jack heard it. It wasn't a coyote. Coyotes were smart enough to be underground. It was a sound so thin, so brittle, that it sounded like glass breaking. "Mama, wake up." Jack froze. He squinted into the swirling whiteout. 20 yards away, at the edge of the corpse dump behind the saloon, sat a wagon. It was a prairie schooner, but its canvas was shredded, flapping uselessly like a broken sail. No horses. They had probably been eaten or frozen days ago. A faint, dying orange glow flickered from inside. Jack's brain, still swimming in alcohol, told him to ignore it. "Walk away, Jack. Not your problem. You can barely keep yourself alive." But his feet didn't listen. He crunched through the knee-deep drifts, the snow groaning under his boots like dry styrofoam. He reached the wagon. The wood was covered in a layer of hoarfrost an inch thick. He grabbed the canvas flap. It was frozen stiff. He had to crack it open. The smell hit him before the sight. It wasn't the smell of the unwashed miners in the saloon. It was sweeter, sicklier, the smell of gangrene and old sickness. Inside, lit by the last inch of a tallow candle, was a tableau of hell. A woman sat propped against a crate. She was Salish Native American, her copper skin turned a terrifying shade of gray-blue. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, covered in a milky film of cataracts or exhaustion. Around her, curled like puppies seeking heat from a dying mother, were 3 children. They weren't moving. They weren't shivering. That was the worst sign. When the shivering stops, death is minutes away. And at their feet, taking up the only space where a fire could have been, lay a man. Or what was left of him. He was wrapped in a canvas tarp stiff as a board. Frozen solid. Jack looked at the woman. She blinked. Once. It was slow, like a lizard in winter. She wasn't waiting for help. People in this condition don't hope. She was just counting the heartbeats until the end. Jack looked at the smallest child, a girl maybe 3 years old. Her lips were blue. She was chewing on a piece of leather strap, part of a horse harness, trying to suck nutrition out of tanned hide. The sight sobered Jack Thornton faster than a bucket of ice water. The tarantula juice in his veins turned to acid. He looked back at the saloon. He could hear the muffled sound of the fiddle, the laughter, the warmth. 80 men drinking away their fortunes while 4 human beings froze to death 50 feet from their door. Rage, hot and unfamiliar, exploded in Jack's chest. It wasn't pity. It was fury. Fury at the cold, fury at the gold, fury at God, and mostly fury at himself. He didn't say, "Hold on." He turned back to the saloon, his face twisted into a snarl. He didn't stumble this time. He marched. He kicked the back door open with enough force to splinter the wood. The wind howled into the room, carrying the snow with it, killing the candles near the door. The fiddle stopped. The gambling stopped. Every head turned to look at the madman standing in the doorway, covered in frost, looking like an vengeful ghost from the blizzard. Music's over. Jack roared, his voice cracking with the cold. "Put the cards down. We got work to do." Jack burst back into the saloon like a man possessed. Snow flew from his coat as he strode to the center of the room and slammed his fist down on the nearest table with a crack that silenced even the drunken fiddle player. "Listen up." His voice cut through the noise like a knife. "There's a woman and 3 kids out there in a wagon. Husband's dead. No food, no fire. They're freezing to death while we sit here with our whiskey and our poker games." The silence that followed was profound. In the West, you could shoot a man over a card game, rustle cattle, or jump someone's mining claim, but there was one unbreakable code: you never ever abandoned women and children. Big Tom McCarthy was the first to move. He pulled off his wide-brimmed Stetson, a hat that had cost him 2 weeks' wages, and started walking from table to table. No words were needed. The men understood. What happened next was something Jack would remember for the rest of his life. These were not good men, not in the conventional sense. These were gamblers, claim jumpers, men running from the law or their pasts, or both. They cursed, they fought, they drank themselves into oblivion. But they were also men who understood suffering, who knew what it meant to be on the edge of survival. One by one they reached into their pockets and pulled out leather pouches of gold dust, the currency of the mining camps. They didn't measure or count. They simply poured the dust into Big Tom's hat, handful after handful. Some threw in silver Mexican dollars. One man added a small gold nugget he'd been saving. Another tossed in a silver pocket watch. At the poker table, a professional gambler, a man whose jewelry was as fake as his smile, hesitated for just a moment, then added the rings from his fingers to the collection. The stack of gold dust in the hat grew until it overflowed. Within 5 minutes they'd collected enough to buy that family food, clothing, and shelter for a year, or enough for passage on a stagecoach back to civilization. Jack stood there, hat in hand, staring at his fellow miners. These rough, violent, broken men had just performed an act of grace that would have shamed most saints. "I'll take it to them," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, One-Eyed Pete called out, Tell 'em Merry Christmas." The walk back to that wagon was shorter, this time his step steadier despite the whiskey. Jack's heart hammered in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. When he pulled back the canvas, the woman looked up at him with the same hollow eyes, as if she'd already dismissed his first visit as a hallucination born of desperation. Jack knelt in the snow, ruining his only pair of pants, but not caring, and pressed the hat full of gold and silver into her trembling hands. "Merry Christmas, ma'am," he managed, his voice rough. "From the boys at McGinty's. Get yourself and your babies somewhere warm. Get some food. This should see you through." The woman stared at the hat, then at Jack, then back at the hat. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The oldest child, a girl with her mother's dark eyes, whispered something in a language Jack didn't understand. "No need for thanks," Jack said quickly, backing away. Emotion made him uncomfortable. He'd done what needed doing, that was all. Just take care of them kids. He turned and trudged back toward the saloon, not looking back, not wanting to see gratitude or tears, or anything else that might crack open that thing in his chest even wider. When Jack pushed through the saloon doors, the brief moment of solemnity had already evaporated. Someone had made a crack about Jack getting soft. Someone else suggested his pants were wet for a different reason than snow. Within minutes, an argument over a poker hand erupted into a full-scale brawl. Bottles flew, tables shattered, and fists connected with faces in a symphony of violence that was as predictable as it was pointless. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived to restore order, Jack was nursing split knuckles and a black eye, sitting in the same chair he'd occupied before drinking the same rot-gut whiskey. Christmas in Montana, same as any other night. Jack hadn't left Bannock, though God knows plenty of others had. The gold had played out 2 years ago. The easy veins were stripped bare, and the new strikes in the Dakota Territory had drawn the hungry young men away like moths to a fresh flame. But Jack stayed. Maybe he'd gotten too old to chase the horizon. Or maybe he was just like the slag pile outside the mine, heavy spent, and part of the landscape. It was Christmas Eve, 1868. He sat in the same corner of McGinty's saloon, nursing a whiskey that tasted like regret. The place was quieter now. The rowdy, violent energy of the boomtown was gone, replaced by the hollow echo of a town slowly dying. The air was colder this year, or maybe Jack's blood was just thinner. He was staring into the amber depths of his glass when the bartender, a man with a face like tanned leather, slid something across the scarred wood. It wasn't a bottle. It was a plate wrapped in a cloth napkin so white it looked like a piece of cloud trapped in this dingy, smoke-stained hellhole. Lady from the laundry dropped it off the bartender, grunted, wiping a rag across the bar. "Said you'd know who it came from. Said to tell you. It's the real deal." Jack frowned. His hands, gnarled now with knuckles swollen from years of swinging a pickaxe, reached out. The object was heavy. Surprisingly heavy. He pulled back the cloth. Steam curled up, carrying a scent that hit Jack like a physical blow. It wasn't just the smell of food. It was the smell of a ghost. It smelled of nutmeg, expensive cloves, burnt sugar, and the sharp, oaky bite of brandy. It was a mincemeat pie, but not the delicate, sugary pastries they served in the fancy hotels back east. No. Jack knew what he was looking at. This was a pioneer's pie. A survivor's ration disguised as a celebration. Jack picked it up. The crust was thick, flaky, undoubtedly rolled with lard to withstand the heat of a wood stove. He took a bite, and the taste exploded in his mouth, shocking his system awake after 5 years of beans and bacon. It was dense, heavy. A single bite felt like it weighed a pound in his stomach. Jack closed his eyes and his tongue dissected the flavors with the precision of a man who hadn't eaten a real meal in months. He tasted the meat first, not beef, but venison. The gamey, iron-rich taste of deer, hand-chopped into tiny, precise cubes, not ground into mush. It required patience to chop meat like that. It required time. Then came the sweet. Oh God, the sweet! That distinct rich coating of kidney fat that didn't just melt away, but lingered coating his throat, mixing with the dark, sticky sweetness of currants and dried apples. It was savory, it was sweet, it was fatty, and it was drunk on brandy. Jack knew the history of this pie. He knew that to make it right, you didn't just bake it. You aged it. You mixed the meat, the fat, the fruit, and the spices, and you buried it in a stoneware jar under the snow or in a cold cellar. You let it sit for a month, letting the alcohol kill the bacteria, letting the flavors marry in the darkness, until the meat turned into something candy-like, something eternal. As the warmth of the brandy and the caloric heat of the sweet began to spread through his chest, fighting off the Montana chill, Jack realized what this pie actually meant. Martha hadn't just thrown some leftovers together. She had started making this pie in November. While Jack was drinking his wages away, she was chopping venison. While he was passing out in his shack, she was rendering sweet. While he was forgetting what it meant to be a human being, she was tending to a jar in the dark, waiting, preserving, preparing to save him from the cold for one more night. It was a bomb of energy wrapped in crust. A promise that you could survive the winter if you just had enough substance inside you. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, pricked the corners of Jack's eyes. He ate the whole thing. Every crumb. He ate it like a starving wolf, and for the first time in 5 years, the gnawing emptiness in his gut, the one whiskey could never fill, went quiet. He pushed away from the bar, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the meal anchoring him to the earth. He grabbed his bearskin coat and headed for the back door. The wind outside was screaming, a blizzard wind that could freeze a man's eyelids shut in seconds. But Jack didn't feel it. Not this time. The sweet and the spices were burning like a furnace in his belly. He stepped out into the swirling white darkness, intending to head to the outhouse, but he stopped. She was there. She stood just outside the circle of yellow light spilling from the saloon window. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, thick and well-made, dyed a deep indigo. The hood was pulled up, framing a face that had changed. The hollow, skeletal desperation of the woman in the wagon was gone. In its place was the face of a woman who had fought the frontier and won. Her skin was clear, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She had been waiting for him. In the cold. In the wind. "What are you doing out here?" Jack asked. His voice was rough, scraping against his throat. She didn't answer immediately. She watched him, her dark eyes tracking the steam of his breath. She looked at his battered coat, his graying beard, the way he stood with his shoulders hunched against a world he expected to hurt him. "Did you eat?" she asked. Her voice was calm, cutting through the wind. "I did," Jack said. "Best thing I've tasted since before the war." It was the real deal, Martha. Venison and suet. A faint smile touched her lips. "My grandmother's receipt. She always said a man can't fight the winter on sugar alone. He needs meat. He needs spirit." Jack nodded dumbly. "It was a lot of work for a drunk." "It was a lot of work for the man who saved my children," she corrected him gently. She took a step closer. The snow crunched under her boots. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Jack felt exposed. He felt like that jar of mincemeat must have felt sitting in the dark for weeks, waiting to see if it would spoil or if it would turn into something worth keeping. "I see you, Jack," she said softly. "I see you sitting in there. I see you waiting to fade away. I'm just a miner, Martha. "The gold is gone. The gold in the ground is gone," she said. "But you're still digging for nothing." She paused, the wind whipping a strand of dark hair across her face. She reached up to tuck it back, a gesture so human, so normal, that it made Jack's heart ache. "Don't let yourself go hungry," she said. The words hung in the air, heavier than the snow. She wasn't talking about the pie. She wasn't talking about food. She was talking about the starvation of a soul that had forgotten how to want anything other than oblivion. Jack stood there, this rough, violent man, who had spent 5 years pickling his liver in rotgut whiskey to avoid feeling anything. And now, full of the warmth she had handmade for him, the numbness was failing. The woman turned to go, her silhouette beginning to merge with the Montana darkness. Then she stopped. She didn't turn back, but she spoke loud enough for him to hear over the howling wind. "The boys are asleep. The fire is built up. The house is warm." She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see the profile of her face in the moonlight. "Would you like to come home with me?" For any other man standing there in the biting Montana wind, the answer would have been the simplest word in the English language. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Jack's body reacted before his mind could stop it. His boots shifted in the snow, crushing the ice as he leaned toward her. Just inches away stood everything he had lost: a warm hearth, the smell of soap and cinnamon instead of stale sweat, a family that looked at him with hope instead of disgust. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, Jack Thornton wasn't a broken-down miner. He was just a man being offered a lifeline out of hell. But then reality crashed back in. Behind him, the heavy oak door of McGinty's saloon swung open with a violent bang. A gust of noise spilled out into the silent night, a chaotic symphony of shattered glass, a drunkard's incoherent screaming, and the sour, suffocating stench of cheap whiskey and vomit. The noise hit Jack like a physical slap. It was the sound of his world calling him back. He froze. Slowly, painfully, he looked down at his own hands, illuminated by the faint yellow light spilling from the window. They were trembling. A violent, rhythmic shaking that he couldn't control, the miner's curse, the withdrawal of a body that ran on poison. His knuckles were split and scabbed. His fingernails were permanently blackened with coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. He looked at those ruinous hands. Then he looked at the pristine white linen napkin wrapped around the pie in Martha's grip. It was spotless, pure. The realization hit him with the force of a cave-in. If he stepped into her world, he wouldn't be saving himself. He would be polluting her. He was the mold that rots the wood. He was the fire that burns the house down. What right did a ghost like him have to haunt a home full of life? Jack slowly pulled his foot back, grounding his heel into the freezing mud where he belonged. He forced his trembling hands into his coat pockets, hiding his shame. "I can't," he rasped. The words tasted like ash and iron in his mouth. He cleared his throat, trying to find a voice that didn't sound like it was breaking. "I appreciate the offer, ma'am. Truly. But look at me." He nodded toward the saloon where the shadows of fighting men danced in the window. "You've built yourself a sanctuary, Martha. Something good. Something clean. A man like me." Jack's voice dropped to a whisper barely audible over the wind. "I'd only dirty it up. I'm not the man who saved you anymore. I'm just the guy who stayed behind." Understanding flickered in Martha's dark eyes. There was no judgment there, no pity, only a terrible, quiet recognition. She had seen the trembling. She had heard the saloon door. She knew that some holes were too deep to climb out of. She didn't try to argue. She didn't try to save him. Instead, she gently placed the warm pie on the wooden railing between them, treating it like an offering at a grave. "The pie," she said softly, her voice steady against the gale. "Every Christmas, Jack. I will bring it. Not to fix you, but so you remember." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "That even wolves can be men sometimes." Then she turned, her coat swirling around her, and walked away into the consuming darkness. Jack stood there for a long time, statue still. The cold seeped through his bearskin coat, settling into his marrow, but he didn't move. He watched the spot where she had vanished until his eyes watered from the chill. Finally, he turned back. He reached for the handle of the saloon door. With a heavy sigh, Jack Thornton stepped back into the noise, the smoke, and the comfortable misery of the only life he had left. To the townsfolk of Bannock, Martha Redwing's laundry was a miracle of civilization. It was the smell of lavender and pressed cotton in a town that reeked of manure and greed. But to anyone who knew the mechanics of the frontier, that building wasn't a sanctuary. It was a bomb waiting for a spark. Inside those four pine walls lay the perfect recipe for a catastrophe, a fire triangle so volatile that Martha likely prayed every night not for profit but for survival. Consider the fuel. The air inside the shop was always bone dry, sucked of moisture by the relentless heat of the stove. Strung across the ceiling like spiderwebs were endless lines of clothing, miners' heavy wool unions, cotton shirts, canvas trousers. In that arid heat, the fabric had become desiccated, brittle as straw. They weren't just clothes anymore. They were fuses hanging overhead, waiting to carry flame across the room faster than a man could sprint. Then there was the heat. To boil 50 gallons of water and keep 5 heavy cast iron sad irons, hot enough to press wrinkles out of denim, the central wood stove had to run white-hot 24 hours a day. It was an old iron beast, overworked and tired. Deep inside its belly a hairline crack had formed in the firebox, invisible to the naked eye, slowly widening with every expansion of the metal. Up in the chimney, layers of creosote, that sticky, flammable, tar-form wood smoke, had built up like gunpowder unnoticed. And finally the accelerant. Because the days were short and the work was endless, kerosene lamps hung from the rafters every 10 feet, glass bellies filled with oil swaying gently whenever the door opened. Martha and her children slept in the back room, separated from this inferno by only a thin curtain. They should have smelled the danger, but they didn't. That is the cruel irony of the trade. After years of breathing in caustic lye, soap-thick steam, and the sour sweat of 1,000 miners, their noses had gone blind. Olfactory fatigue, the doctors called it. The sharp tang of smoke didn't register to them anymore. It was just part of the background noise of their lives. But the dog knew. He was a mangy sheepdog mix named Rags, an ugly brute that Jack had saved from a kick in the ribs 2 years prior. He slept by the back door. At 2:00 a.m. the hairline crack in the stove finally gave way. It wasn't a loud explosion, just a pop like a knuckle cracking. A glowing ember no bigger than a fingernail spit out from the breach. It floated upward on the heat thermals, dancing like a firefly, until it settled gently onto the sleeve of a dry cotton shirt hanging on the lowest line. It took 3 seconds for the shirt to catch. It took 10 seconds for the fire to race up the sleeve and ignite the line. In 30 seconds the ceiling was a rolling ocean of fire. The heat rose instantly, melting the solder on a kerosene lamp's handle. The lamp fell. It smashed onto the floorboards, spraying fuel everywhere. WHOOSH. The room didn't just burn, it inhaled. In the back room, Martha turned in her sleep, dreaming of clean sheets. She didn't smell the smoke, but Rags was already moving. The dog didn't bark. Smoke confuses a dog's throat. Instead, panic and instinct took over. He scrambled onto the bed where Martha's youngest boy, little Sam, was sleeping. The dog clawed at the blankets, whining a high-pitched sound of terror. When the boy didn't stir, the dog did the only thing he knew to do. He snapped his jaws around the boy's ankle and bit down. Hard. Sam screamed. That scream was the alarm bell that woke Martha Redwing just as the wall separating their bedroom from the shop disintegrated into ash. 400 yards away in his drafty shack, Jack Thornton woke up coughing. It wasn't a noise that woke him. It was the air. Even half-drunk Jack's lungs, scarred by years of quartz dust, were sensitive. The air tasted like burning pine and disaster. He rolled out of his bunk, his head throbbing with the dull ache of cheap whiskey. He kicked open his door and looked up the valley. The sky wasn't black. It was a bruised, violent purple lit from beneath by a terrifying orange pulse. "No," Jack whispered. The word scraped his throat. No, no, no. He didn't run like a young man. He couldn't. His knees were shot, his back was stiff. He shuffled, moving as fast as his broken body would allow, wheezing with every step. By the time he reached the laundry, the scene was straight out of Dante. The bucket brigade had formed a line of men passing leather buckets from the creek, but they were standing 50 feet back, shielding their faces. The heat was radiant, a physical weight that pushed you away. The windows had blown out. The fire was eating the oxygen so fast it created a vacuum sucking air in with a sound like a freight train. There inside a miner screamed, his face soot blackened. I heard him, but the fronts blocked. Jack looked at the building. The roof was sagging. The kerosene lamps inside were popping one by one, bang, 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 sending fresh jets of blue and yellow flame shooting out the windows. Jack Thornton stopped. He looked at the men holding buckets, terror in their eyes. He looked at the fire, and for a second he thought about turning around. He was 60 years old. He was a drunk. He was nobody. But then he remembered the taste of mincemeat pie. He remembered venison and suet. He remembered the woman who had told him not to go hungry. Jack spotted a horse trough near the hitching post. The water was green, stagnant, and covered in scum. He didn't hesitate. He climbed over the edge and submerged himself, coat, boots, and all. The shock of the icy water seized his heart, nearly stopping it. He came up gasping, water streaming from his beard, heavy and sodden. "Jack, don't be a fool, Big," Tom yelled. Jack didn't answer. He lowered his head and charged the back door. He didn't walk into the fire. He crawled. The air inside was superheated, over 400 degrees at head level. If he stood up, his lungs would scorch instantly. He kept his face in the mud of the floor, slithering like a snake. The sound was deafening. The roar of the fire, the crashing of timber, the hiss of boiling sap exploding from the pine walls. "Martha," he tried to yell, but it came out as a croak. He found them in the corner. They were trapped behind a massive support beam that had fallen from the ceiling, pinning the door shut. The dog Rags was barking madly at the wood, his fur singed. Martha was on the floor, shielding the children with her own body, a wet quilt thrown over them. The quilt was steaming. It was drying out. In seconds, it would burn. Jack reached the beam. It was raw timber, heavy and engulfed in flame at one end. He grabbed it. There was no adrenaline rush that masked the pain. That's a lie, told in dime novels. There was only pain. Immediate, blinding, white-hot pain. The skin on his palms didn't just blister, it hissed. It sounded like bacon hitting a hot skillet. Jack screamed. It was an ugly, guttural sound, the sound of an animal in a trap. Heave. The beam didn't move. He was too old, too weak. He looked at Martha. She was looking at him from under the quilt, her eyes wide, reflecting the flames. She didn't look at him like a hero. She looked at him like he was her last hope. Jack let go of the beam. He jammed his shoulder, his bad shoulder, the one he'd dislocated in the mines under the wood. The heat of the timber burned through his wet coat, searing the skin of his shoulder. He dug his boots into the floorboards. He thought of the gold dust in the hat. He thought of the pie. He thought of the cold wind and the empty shack. Get out! Jack drove his legs down. He didn't lift with his muscles. He lifted with his bones. He felt something in his back pop, a sickening tear of muscle. He didn't care. The beam shifted. It groaned and slid 6 inches. Just 6 inches. Go! He roared, blood spraying from his lip where he'd bitten through it. Martha didn't hesitate. She shoved the children through the gap. The dog scrambled after them. Then she grabbed Jack's collar. He was done. His legs were jelly. The smoke had filled his head with darkness. She dragged him. A small woman, fueled by the terrifying strength of a mother, dragged a full-grown man, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. They tumbled out of the back door and into the mud just as the laundry gave up its fight. Crack, boom. The roof collapsed inward. A geyser of sparks shot 100 feet into the night sky. The rush of air knocked them flat. Jack lay face down in the muck. The cold night air felt like a miracle against his skin. He rolled over, retching, coughing, up black soot and fluid. He couldn't feel his hands. He held them up to his face. They were curled into claws, black and red, shaking violently. Not from whiskey this time. From shock. Martha was crawling toward him, her face streaked with tears and soot. She was checking the children. They were crying, terrified but alive. Jack let his head drop back into the mud. He closed his eyes. The pain was coming now, a tidal wave of it waiting to drown him. But as the darkness pulled him under, Jack Thornton smiled. A broken, bloody smile. He wasn't hungry anymore. Jack woke up 3 days later with his hands wrapped in bandages and Martha Redwing sitting beside his bed. "You're alive," she said simply. Disappointed, Jack croaked. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. "The children want to thank you. Tell them they're welcome. Now let me die in peace." But Martha didn't leave. Instead, she told him what had happened while he was unconscious. The same miners who'd filled a hat with gold dust 5 years ago had gathered again. This time they brought hammers and nails and lumber. In 3 days, working dawn to dusk, they'd rebuilt her laundry. Not just rebuilt, improved it. They'd installed a brick fireplace, far safer than the old wood stove. They'd dug her a well right beside the building, so she wouldn't have to haul water. They'd built it stronger, better, safer. And they'd done it for free. Why, Jack asked, though he knew the answer. "Because that's what we do," Martha said. "We take care of our own." Jack Thornton's hands healed, though they never lost the scars from the burning timber. He never did move into Martha Redwing's house. That would have been too much like hope, too much like believing he deserved happiness. But he did become a fixture there. He fixed things that broke. He chopped wood. He scared off the occasional drunk who forgot that Martha's laundry was sacred ground. He taught her son to throw a punch and her daughters how to spot a card cheat. And every Christmas Eve there was a mincemeat pie waiting for him at the bar in McGinty's saloon. The miners who'd filled that hat with gold dust never spoke of it again. That wasn't their way. But every one of them, when they dropped off their laundry, treated Martha with a respect that bordered on reverence. And if someone new to town made the mistake of being rude to her, they'd find themselves educated, usually with fists, about the code of the West. You could shoot a man over cards. You could jump his claim. You could drink yourself to death or fight until your knuckles were raw. But you never ever abandoned the women and children. And once you'd chosen to protect something, you protected it with everything you had. Jack died in 1891, at the age of 62, his liver finally giving out after decades of abuse. At his funeral, Martha Redwing stood beside a grave in the Bannock Cemetery and placed a mincemeat pie on the fresh-turned earth. "Don't go hungry," she whispered to the wind. Around her stood a crowd of aging miners, fewer each year, their backs bent, their hands gnarled with arthritis, their glory days long behind them. These men, who'd once been young and wild and certain they'd strike it rich, had found something more valuable than gold in those frozen mountains. They'd found each other. And for one perfect moment on a Christmas Eve in 1863, they'd chosen to be better than they were. That was the real gold strike. That was the fortune that lasted. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.